This week we have two different portions that we tend to read from the book of Numbers, Matot Maseh, and they contain one of, I think, an interesting law in the Torah because it presents an interesting problem. So of course there had to be a unique solution. What do you do when somebody accidentally kills somebody else? Obviously it was not intentional, but how do we punish? What does it mean in the community? So what the authors in the Bible chose to do was to create this whole concept of the city of refuge, where if you were actually guilty of the crime, you would go. And the interesting thing is that there was some humaneness in a way, if you think about it. Unlike a regular jail or prison where you go alone and we isolate you from society, we put you in adult timeout, it doesn't necessarily impact your family either. Because when we put you in prison today, and then you're cut off from your family. And as somebody who's learning about family dynamics, when you cut off somebody from the family, it still impacts the rest of the family. In effect, everybody in that unique small system is put in jail. In the city of refuge, on the other hand, we have something different. The individual goes to the city of refuge, but their family, their immediate family, can go with them. So it's not as if they're alone, but you can imagine what it must have been like in the city of refuge itself. I'm not saying that this actually existed because I don't know for sure if it did, but it would be a place of tremendous shame and embarrassment. It would also be a place where you can imagine there's a lot of dangerous people, maybe even some careless people. It's not a place where you decide to yell out of your car, "You so-and-so for so-and-so," when they cut you off on 7585 North in Atlanta. You may choose not to do that in the city of refuge because maybe you don't know who actually was the perpetrator and who actually is the tag-along family unit. But it also begs the question that I think which is interesting, is that where we read in the book of Numbers, "You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no expiation for blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of one who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I myself abide, for I, God, abide among the Israelite people." There's a recognition that it's not that there's just a defilement in the society itself by somebody being careless or reckless, intentional or unintentionally, but there's a defilement to the very land that everybody lives on. And when we think about it, I thought about it today. I don't know if you're paying attention. We are, after all, in the Anthropocene epoch, an era that's marked by 1950, 1951, where the land is in fact being defiled by the human imprint that is put on it. We are in fact not taking good care of the earth. We are altering the planet with human constructs. And the question, I think, is, can we keep the land pure? And the answer, if we understand, at least we're able to extrapolate the concept of the city of refuge being put together by people who knowingly or not knowingly, but certainly without intent, was that they had to be carried off the land to ensure that the land itself would remain pure. We haven't done that as a society today. We have in fact maintained our systems which have allowed us to be careless for the land. Careless enough to think that we can just take and take and take with no consequences at all. When the land becomes defiled, we read that God, in fact, calls out and spews the residents of the land out from it. At least so it claims in the book of Leviticus. What the priestly book, I think, was articulating is that there is a sanctity of the land, and that part of our covenantal obligation with God is to maintain that sanctity. That it's not just a covenantal obligation to maintain sanctity amongst interpersonal relationships, but that we must also continue that sanctity toward the earth, which is where our creation comes from. In the Hebrew Bible, we often see that the land and those reside on it have a counterbalance of forces, which are delicately aligned and dependent on human behavior as an aspiration for purity. Purity is maintained in a variety of ways, some of which we can all think about. The laws of kosher, the mikvah, we kind of have to go forth. When the temple stood, it was through sacrifice. The idea that we actually had to give something of ourselves to expiate the sin that we had done. In other words, we didn't just have to make things right, we had to do something in order to make it right. It wasn't enough for us to decide, I'm going to no longer have that person in my midst. There was a ritual associated to keep the land pure, and I have to ask, what are we doing ritualistically to keep our land pure? When I see the news that Death Valley this coming weekend is expected to hit 130 degrees, it will be the hottest place on the entire planet. That tells me that we need to expiate something. We need to, in fact, do something. We have to change something. And the Hebrew Bible informs us that ritual is one of the things that we can use to change how we choose to engage. That if we use, we have to return. Then we'd have to do so with compassion. That we are, in fact, stewards of the earth. The whole idea of rituals and purity, of course, creates some sort of a unique religious experience at a time and an era when people are finding religion to be less and less important. I think actually the opposite is true. Now it's even more imperative that we engage in ritual, that we look and use the language of religion to question, are we in fact being good stewards of the earth? How can we be better stewards of the planet? How can we choose to make sure that while we may not have necessarily understood what we did, just like the persons who perpetrated manslaughter may not necessarily have understood what they were doing when they allowed the ox to go goring through the city, or they may have made an actual mistake, there still was a responsibility from the community toward the person who did it, because collectively there was a broader understanding that they had a responsibility toward each other, not to allow the damage of that sin to linger on the land and the damage of that sin to linger within our society or their society. I know that's a challenging task for all of us, because for many of us, when we're faced with the problems and environmental concerns, we simply look and say, the job is just too great. Who am I? What good can I do? And I have to remind all of you the same thing I remind myself when I ask that same question. Yes, turn the faucet off while I'm brushing my teeth. Recycle just a little bit. Though some people argue don't recycle at all, there's debates around that, because of the waste and where the waste ends up, not because it's a bad idea whatsoever. Be conscious of what temperature to set the house at, and recognize that if all of us do just a little collectively, we can make a difference. And that is our collective responsibility. It is incumbent upon us. May you be inspired as we face the next week of heat together to recognize that this Anthropocene age has happened, and it may not necessarily be your fault, but collectively it is our responsibility to address it. Shabbat Shalom.